There is no better way to practice brushstrokes than to pick very easy and simple subjects. So today we are going to practice our brushstrokes on this tutorial that comprehends some cherries hanging from a branch with some leaves. We are going to practice how to use a flat brush, some round brushes, how to use the wet on wet technique and the wet on dry technique. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start painting together. The way I approach to paint this botanical subject is to start painting the leaves with some gray ink. So in the brown jar that you see, I am taking some gray ink that I've prepared beforehand, and with my flat brush I start preparing the leaves of this composition. I imagine these leaves hanging from a branch that I will create in a second moment in the center. So the first two leaves I've created are on the left side of the branch, and this leaf I'm creating now is on the right side of the branch I will create. When I'm creating these leaves, I remember to change the color value of this gray ink. And I now take my round brush in size 6 to start adding through the wet on wet technique some green color. In particular, I'm adding some green earth and cobalt green dark to this gray ink, and also a little bit of Azomethine green yellow. I like to add these green paints in this moment because they will blend with the gray ink while the first layer, the gray ink, is still wet. In this way, I will not control too much how the blending effect will turn out, and I think in this way I can really play with watercolor paints and enjoy the process, seeing what the paint itself will do at the end. With this same round brush, I am taking a little bit of burnt umber and yellow ochre to start to create the branch in the middle of these leaves. I'm not adding too much pressure, and I also remember to create this branch with not really a very straight shape, but being this branch a little bit curved, to give it a little bit more of a realistic look. From these branches I attach the leaves, so I create some short brush strokes in brown color, and I'm also adding the same brush strokes where I imagine other leaves being hanged, but also where I imagine the cherries to be painted in a second moment. Just for reference, the paper I'm using is half of a sheet of Saunders Waterford watercolor paper. The paper usually it's 12 by 9 inches, and I just cut it in half, and I'm using half of a sheet to create this botanical composition. With this round brush, I am now creating the cherries that are hanging from the branch. To create these fruits, I'm creating a mixture on my color palette of Scarlet Red with a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta and a touch of Quinacridone Purple. I allow these colors to be mixed already on the color palette, but I also add through the wet on wet technique a few brush strokes of more concentrated Scarlet Red or, for example, Quinacridone Purple while the layer is still wet. When you are creating these cherries, remember that you can play with the color values of the pigments you're using. And for example, as I'm doing in this moment, you can create two cherries next to each other where one is more concentrated, has more pigment on its surface compared to another cherry. And you do this removing part of the pigment in the cup of water. Playing with color values is very important in watercolor because even if you are painting, for example, a very abstract subject or a subject that is quite loose and not too realistic, you can really play with color values to give to your composition a very natural effect. So for this reason, I encourage you while you're painting these cherries, but also the leaves of this botanical subject, to remember to remove a part of the pigment in your cup of water to create on your brush and then on the paper different color values. I thought to create this tutorial especially for beginners, and as you noticed, I've used a smaller size of paper because I really think it can help removing some pressure when you have to paint a full page, a larger page, let's say. So this is a recommendation if you are just starting to paint in watercolor and you like to paint botanical or flower subject. Remember that you can always start creating a beautiful composition in smaller sizes of paper, and in that way you have more control of what you are creating because you need to focus on fewer elements. So this is just a tip that I felt like sharing with all of my friends here. Back to this painting, I kept creating leaves, and I've decided to create quite big leaves on the left side and on the right side of this branch. I imagine some leaves being tucked behind the cherries that I've created, and I've used the same approach as in the beginning. This means that I created these leaves using different concentrations of grey ink that I have in my brown jar, and then using different mixtures of greens that I have in my color palette, I add with my round brush a few brush strokes while the first layer of grey is still wet. Now, for the leaves on the right side of this branch, I've decided to create a mixture a little bit darker, mixing some Cobalt Green Dark and some Quinacridone Purple on my color palette, and allowing this dark green mixture to blend on the first grey layer. I'm using this darker color mixture because this type of purple is the same that I've used on the mixture for the cherries, and in this way I'm sort of creating a link, a sort of bridge between the color of the leaves and the color of the cherries. If you're enjoying watching this video and if you like to paint along with me, please press like on this video because it really helps me to create free content for you to watch. Also, if you like tutorials in these styles, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me on this journey. With this same brush and with a mixture of brown, a little bit of burnt umber and yellow ochre, I am adding to these leaves a little bit of more concentrated brown mixture to blend into the wet layer of these leaves. Basically, I am playing with the wet on wet technique and adding many layers of different colors that will blend when the whole painting is going to be completely dry. We started with a first layer of grey ink, and then we added some brush strokes of a mixture of green, and in this moment I also added a little bit of brown. With the same brush, I created a mixture of gouache color of a little bit of black and brown, and I am just refining the shape of this branch in the middle. I'm using some gouache here because I really want this element to pop from the whole composition, and therefore I'm using gouache because gouache is a type of water-based medium that is more opaque compared to watercolor. And at this point, with this same round brush, I'm taking a little bit of grey ink and I'm adding some little leaves on the left and on the right side of this branch. Basically, I am adding leaves to my liking, creating quite a heavy composition in leaves. You can add as many leaves as I've created, or you can decide to create a sort of lighter type of composition with less of these elements. On these small leaves, I like to give an accent of this dark mixture of green, and I'm mixing some Azomethine green yellow with Quinacridone purple on my color palette, and I'm allowing this dark green to blend. At this point, I'm just looking at the whole composition and I am deciding where to add these darker brush strokes. When I paint in watercolor, I always like to have some contrasting brush strokes that really highlight some elements of the composition. And so this is what I'm doing while the first layer of these leaves is still wet. And at this point I change my brush and I take my silver black velvet brush and I redefine the shape of these cherries. I'm doing this because I noticed that while the painting was drying up, it became a little bit too light for my liking. I really wanted these red cherries to pop from the composition, and therefore I just started to add another layer of Scarlet Red with a little bit of Quinacridone Purple on these cherries. So here my recommendation for you is remember that in watercolor painting you can always improve what you have created on your first layer. Even if your first layer is not exactly what you expected, remember that you can work on this layer with additional brush strokes, either when the painting is still wet or when this is already dry. In this case, I'm highlighting the shape of these cherries with different mixtures of Scarlet Red, Quinacridone Magenta, and a little bit of Quinacridone Purple. I am really creating some cherries in a color that is more towards the Quinacridone Purple, while others are more towards the Scarlet Red. In this way, I am able to create different cherries that really pop from this botanical composition and also with different color values in order to give to this whole painting sort of a more vivid and quite realistic sort of look. For your own painting, look at what you have created, and if you are already satisfied with the color and the shape of your cherries, you can skip this part. Or, for example, you can decide to add just a few brush strokes through the wet on dry technique on these cherries to highlight just a few parts or just a few cherries of this composition. And at this point I'm satisfied with the color of these cherries, and with this same brush I'm just taking a little bit of brown gouache to create a few brown elements that are connecting the additional leaves that I've created and the cherries to the main branch. Using such a fine brush will allow me to create for these small leaves really very fine brush strokes on this botanical subject. And so I am able to create very fine elements that don't take too much attention from the eyes of the observer. And now I am mixing on my color palette some brown with a little bit of Quinacridone Purple. The brown is a gouache color and the Quinacridone Purple is a watercolor paint. With these two colors and with a little bit of Cobalt Green Dark, I start to create a few layers on the leaves of this botanical composition. I like to create layers with this round brush from Silver Black Velvet because it has such a fine tip that I am able to create very fine lines, but also when I want to create thicker brush strokes, I just need to add a little bit more pressure. And so in this phase of the composition, I am just creating these brush strokes all over the composition where these leaves are located. When I create these layers, I don't aim to have these layers perfectly aligned with the shape of my leaves, but I really like to create a few brush strokes that are quite detached from the composition, and in this case from the leaves themselves, and really I like to play in order to create something a little bit more vintagey, let's say. I really like in this period to play very much with this type of contrasting brush strokes. You can add in this phase as many brush strokes in this way as you prefer, but remember that you can always skip this phase if you are not interested in adding layers in this style. In fact, when you play in watercolor and when you create watercolor paintings, you can always just create overall compositions just using, for example, the wet on wet technique, skipping, let's say, this part of adding layers through the wet on dry technique. These botanical subjects are some of my favorites to paint in watercolor recently, but it's true they are quite different from the flower composition we have painted so far. Let me know in the comments below if you also enjoy painting this type of subjects and if you would like to see more videos in this style. Thank you for watching!